Today's daf we're going to be learning is Masechet Avodah Zarah daf Ayin Gimel. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started from the Mishna at the top of the daf. Yayin nesech asul v'oser b'kosher. Okay, we have a fairly simple Mishnah, but once we get to the Gemara, it's going to really complicate things. So the Mishnah says, Yayin nesech asul v'oser b'kosher. Okay, we know this yayin nesech, wine that was used as a libation, is forbidden and forbids in any amount. Okay, where is this forbidding in any amount? We're going to see right now. Yayin b'yayin, umayim b'mayim b'kosher. If wine mixes with wine that was used as a libation with kosher wine, or water that was used, that was offered up to idols, mixes with regular water, this is what we call mino, two of the same type. We've learned this before, but kosher. It's forbidden in any amount because we said that when two things have the same taste, we can't say that one taste nullifies the other because the taste of the wine is still there in the other wine, or the taste of the water with the other water. So it can't be nullified because there's no overpowering of one taste overpowering the other because they're the same taste. Yayin b'mayim, umayim b'yayin, but if it's either wine into water or water into wine, here they seem to mean, now the way normally we'd use this, until we get to the Gemara and they change this, but we assume it means wine that was used as a libation mixed in permitted water, or water that was forbidden mixed up in kosher wine. Okay, why do we assume it goes in that way? Because usually when we talk about a mixture, we're talking about everything was mutar, permitted, and then something got dumped in, right? Like your milk into your cholent or something. And that's a little different because that's basar and chalab, each one is permitted, but as soon as you put one into the other, it forbids it. But normally we're talking about something of forbidden substance falls into a permitted substance. When will it forbid it? Only if it's enough that it gives flavor, which giving flavor could be determined either by tasting it, like obviously a Jew wouldn't taste it, would be forbidden, but if you find a non-Jew to taste, or the general amount we say is shishim, 1 in 60, right? If the ratio is more than 1 in 60, like 2 in 60 or something, then already it will be forbidden. Ki'ata Rav Dimi. Now here comes the Gemara, which is going to complicate our Mishnah. What we're going to do is we're going to bring Rav Dimi's statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Dimi and most of the characters you're going to see today are people who brought the Torah of Israel to Babylonia. Okay, so they lived in Israel, but then they went to Babylonia. They were called the Nechute because they would go down, like the opposite of making Aliyah. They would go down to Babylonia, and they would bring the Torah of the rabbis of Israel. So the first statement we have is Rav Dimi. He says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, if you're pouring yayin nesech, forbidden wine, from a barrel into the pit, where there's a lot of wine, and we're assuming in the pit there's kosher wine, and you start pouring non-kosher wine, right, yayin nesech wine, into the pit. Afilu kol hayom kulo, you could keep pouring all day long. That's an exaggeration, but they're using an example of all day long. Rishon bata. This is a different halacha. As each drop of wine that you're pouring from the barrel into the pit hits the pit, it immediately, now remember, what's in the pit is permitted. Every drop that hits the pit becomes automatically nullified into the pit, which means that every Isser drop that drops, as soon as it hits, there's 60 of the wine of heter against the wine that's falling in, and it overpowers it, and it's actually all permitted. That's what Rav Dimi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. To which the Gemara says, well, then our Mishnah makes no sense. T'nan. Yayin nesech asur v'oser b'kol shehu. Right? It says, yayin nesech is forbidden, and forbids in any amount, meaning, right, wine falls into wine, it's going to forbid the rest of the wine. And what did we say? My lav de kanafali surah lego hetera. Isn't it when forbidden wine, isn't that the way we understood the Mishnah? Forbidden wine falls into permitted wine, all the wine becomes forbidden. So that seems to contradict, because we just said if it falls into heter, even if it's mino, right, it'll all be canceled. Every drop gets swallowed up by the heter, and it's all going to be permitted. To which the Gemara says, no, de kanafel hetera legoi surah. We're going to explain the Mishnah as the opposite case, not what we thought. When we said yayin b'yayin forbids b'kosher, what we mean is, if permitted wine falls into forbidden wine, then, and now Rav Dimi is going to fit perfectly, Rishon batel. Now the nullification is going to go in the opposite direction here. Same idea. Something falls into something else. Every drop that falls is going to be nullified into what's in the pit. But what's in the pit? Isser, forbidden substance. So now all the permitted wine that falls in is going to be automatically, every drop gets swallowed up by the Isser and overpowered by it. And that's why the whole thing is going to be forbidden. Okay? And that's how Rav Dimi has to read the Mishnah. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So that was difficulty 1 with Rav Dimi on the first part of the Mishnah, which talked about Oser b'kolshu, yayin b'yayin. And now we're going to say it means not what we thought, that forbidden wine falls into permitted wine, but actually permitted wine falls into forbidden wine. And that's why every drop that falls immediately becomes forbidden, nullified into the big mixture of Isser, of forbidden substance, and therefore swallowed up into it. But we're going to keep going with problems with the next lines of the Mishnah. So we're going to have 3 questions, all from our Mishnah. Tashma, yayin b'mayim b'notein ta'am. Now, here when we get to min b'she'eno mino, notice Rav Dimi didn't distinguish between min b'mino and min b'she'eno mino. Okay? He actually was talking about min b'mino. Okay? Obviously, if it works for min b'mino, and we could be lenient and say rishon batel, every drop gets nullified, then we could say the same thing for min b'she'eno mino. Okay? So now we're going to say the following. Yayin b'mayim b'notein ta'am. So when you have min b'she'eno mino, okay, which again we assume means wine, forbidden wine, falls into permitted water. If there's enough water to overpower the wine, it's permitted. If there's too much wine and there's not 60 of water against it, then the wine is going to forbid the whole thing. Now, this is when wine that's forbidden falls into, as we just said, water that's permitted. And if you say rishon batel, every drop that falls is nullified, it should be nullified all into the heter, and it should all be permitted. So why is it forbidden if there's too much, right? If there's not enough water against the wine? To which the Gemara says, lo dekanefil chamra de'atera l'maya d'isura, just like they did with the first part, and just like they're going to do with the third difficulty in a minute. It's actually a case, and now we're going to reread the entire Mishnah, is a case where, again, now only part 2 of the Mishnah, permitted wine actually falls into forbidden water. In other words, water, again, that was offered up to idols. So the wine is going to be nullified into the forbidden water. Now what happens? Now you have to think for a minute. It said it's forbidden b'notein tam. Right now, let's ignore the notein tam. Let's just say it's forbidden. Why is it forbidden? Because as we poured it in, it got swallowed up by the Isser. Okay? And that fits in with what Rav Dimi said. The problem is that it should be forbidden kosher then. So the answer that you have to give, Rashi adds this, is it must be in this case, it was poured all at once. Because if it wasn't poured, if it's poured all at once, right, the only reason why rishon batel happens is because, and we didn't talk about this before, but the assumption is we're talking about where you poured slowly, and then we can view the drops independently, and they all get kind of swallowed up as they go in. But if you dump the whole thing at once, all the forbidden water, all the permitted, it's the yayin b'mayim, right, all the permitted wine onto the forbidden water, and you poured it all at once, then it's only going to be forbidden if it's notein tam. Okay, so even though we normally say rishon batel, in this case there is no rishon batel, and it'll actually be forbidden if it all falls at once, as long as there's not enough of the isser, not enough of the heter against the isser. There has to be more isser in it, not 1 in 60, but let's say 2 in 60. Now we're going to move to the third question. And the third question is really very similar to the second question, because the third question is focused on the next words. I just want to remind you of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, yayin b'mayim umayim b'yayin, wine in water or water in wine b'notein tam. So until now we talked about the yayin b'mayim, the first case, wine into water, which we thought meant forbidden wine into permitted water. In the end we said, no, it was permitted wine into forbidden water. So now the Gemara is going to say, well, if you just explain that the water was the forbidden part, and let's jump to the next case. Water in wine, we're going to assume then the water there in the third case, in the next part, is also forbidden water. And then what's going to be the problem? It says water into wine. It's going to be forbidden into permitted. And then we're going to have the case we keep trying to avoid and changing, but now we're going to have Isser into Heter. And then the question is, why isn't it Rishon Batel? So again, we're going to, and this kind of, you just have to assume that they ignore the fact that we just answered this question in some other way. But anyway, we'll get back there in a minute. So midoresha b'mayadi surah seifa nami b'mayadi surah. Now I'm going to read what I just said outside, inside. Since the resha is water that's forbidden, seifa is also water that's forbidden. And katani seifa, notice what it says in the seifa. This is just all what I just told you outside. Mayim b'yayin b'notein tam, which means forbidden water falls into permitted wine, which means that according to Rav Dimi, it should be kama batel, rishon batel. Every drop that falls in is going to be nullified. Now, why I say they ignore the previous answer, because they don't say, oh, it all fell bevat achad, like Rashi explains in the previous, right? If Rashi's right, that we just said, well, the whole thing fell all at once, and there isn't rishon batel, well, they're ignoring that for right now, because it's as if, like, they didn't really hear the last answer. What they heard of the last answer was, well, we just changed the mayim. We thought the mayim was the permitted substance. Now we see the mayim is the forbidden. Then we're going to assume the water in the next line is also forbidden. And then we're going to have Isra into Heter. And that doesn't fit with Rav Dimi. So Amar Lacha Rav Dimi, Kulam Anitin Hetera L'go Isura. And that's what we keep saying in every single answer now. And this is the third difficulty we raised. We now answer the same thing, which is no. Don't think the Mishna is talking about forbidden something that falls into permitted. Where there, maybe we would say Rishon Batel. But the whole Mishna is talking about permitted falls into forbidden. I want to just point out something really important, which I didn't mention before, which I should have really, which is what's the whole premise of forbidden being at the bottom or permitted being at the bottom? And why is it Rishon Batel, that it gets absorbed into the bottom? Because the assumption is that what's standing and stationary, that has more strength to it, right? So if you're pouring something into something else, what's at the bottom is going to have more power to overcome the other thing, because that's not moving. And that's a certain premise that this sugya is built upon. And if it was heter at the bottom, it would actually be permitted. But they're going to say, right, so again, since Rav Dimi is going to say the Homish is heter in Isura. Now, we said, but if the water was forbidden in the first part, wouldn't we assume it's forbidden in the second part? No. Reisha de Kanefel, when it says yayin b'mayim, it means permitted wine into forbidden water. And when it says mayim b'yayin, it means permitted water into forbidden wine. We swap which one's permitted, which one's forbidden, okay, as we swap the direction. Because again, we always want to have it heter into isser, and that will explain why it's forbidden b'notein tam. As again, you have to sort of neutralize forbidden. That's why it's forbidden. Why only b'notein tam? Well, only b'notein tam because it all fell at once. Okay, so that's what we're going to read inside now. So, Reisha de Kanefel Chamer de Atera L'mayid Yisura. So the first part is talking about wine into water. And Sefer de Kanefel Mayid de Atera L'chamer de Yisura. And the second part is when Mayim of Heter falls into wine that was forbidden. And then both cases, the forbidden thing is at the bottom. That's why it's forbidden. Why not B'Koshu and why only Notein Tam? So that Rashi adds, even though again I'm going to raise this as a bit of a difficulty of the sugya because it doesn't say this anywhere, but Rashi mentions that it must be it all fell all at once. Otherwise it would be forbidden actually b'mashu because Rishon Batel, every drop of heter that falls into Isser is going to be immediately swallowed up. Okay, that was all Rav Dimi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan who brought this big chidush of Rishon Batel. Every drop that falls in, now we learned that if you do it slowly, every drop is nullified. If you do it all at once, then we don't view it like that. Ki ata Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef am Rabbi Yochanan. Now we move to the second person who brings the statement of Rabbi Yochanan from Babylonia. He comes from Israel, he goes to Babylonia, and he says this is what Rabbi Yochanan said. And he has a minor variation, or maybe not so minor, what Rav Dimi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Hama'arei nesech mitzirtzur katan lebol. If you're pouring from a small jug into the pit, afilu kol hayom kulo, even all day long, Rishon Batel. So he says Rishon Batel, but he says specifically when you're pouring from a jug into the pit. V'dafka tzirtzur katan. Now they say here, listen to his words. He's talking obviously about a small jug, dilo nafesh amude, because when you pour it, the stream is not so strong from a jug. Aval chavit, but think about pouring a barrel. When you pour a barrel, the nafesh amude, low. When you pour a barrel, it actually streams out pretty quickly because it's got a very big opening. So there's no concept of Rishon Batel. So we have two versions of Rabbi Yochanan. Does he hold Rishon Batel, every drop that falls is Batel, even from a barrel, or only if you're pouring from a jug? Now we get to the third statement. This already is a different statement. Maybe I'll point out later why I think this is here. I mean, it's here because it is similar to talking about nullification, but it's a completely different issue. And we'll see only later, possibly, why this was brought here. Ki ata Ravin amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ye nesech shenafal lebol, v'nafal sham kiton shamayim. We have wine that was used as a libation, so it's forbidden. It falls into a pit full of other wine, which normally we say mino, right? Mino, we're assuming this is, let's say, it fell all at once. Okay, we're not talking about Rishon Batel. So we have permitted wine. Into it falls forbidden wine. They're mino, two of the same type, not Batel. But then, okay, so basically what does it mean it's not Batel? It means this whole substance is forbidden. So let's say we have 1 part wine of forbidden wine to 20 parts of permitted wine, okay? So now you have 21 parts of wine, okay, measurements, whatever it is. 21, we call it a log, doesn't matter. 21 measurements of wine. 20 are permitted, 1 is forbidden, but now all 21 become forbidden. Then, what happens next? Nafal sham kiton shamayim. Now we have a whole jug of water that falls in, and let's assume the water is 60 parts. Okay, this is very important because there's 60 parts wine against 21 parts of forbidden wine. Now that would never be batel, that wine. However, if you look at that combo of wine, you have 1 part that's really usher and 20 parts that just became usher because of the one that's forbidden. So does the 60 of the water that now falls in, does that now that's min b'she'eno mino, that to the wine is 2 different types. And that's, again, the wine to the rest of the wine, the forbidden and permitted is min b'mino. That forbids b'kolshu, any amount. But if it's water to wine, that's 2 different types. So the water theoretically could overpower the wine. So, according to what Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef says in the name of, Ravin says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ro'in et ha'etel ki'ilu eno, we ignore the 20. The 20 that we said was forbidden, it's really only forbidden because it's got forbidden wine mixed into it. But it's not really counted as forbidden substance as compared to the water. So when the water of 60 falls into this 21 parts of wine, which really only has 1 part that's forbidden, even though we call the whole substance of the 21 forbidden, we ignore the wine that's in there that's forbidden, the 20, that we made forbidden because of the mixture, okay? And now, if you ignore that wine that was originally permitted, that only became forbidden because of the one of wine that was mixed in with it, we ignore it. And now, if we ignore it, what are we left with? 1 part wine that's forbidden, 60 parts water that's permitted, overpowers it, right? And we're good. And then you can drink that whole substance. So even though the wine temporarily became forbidden, it really was forbidden only because of the forbidden wine that was mixed in. It was forbidden as what we call a ta'arovet, as a mixture that had some sort of Isser substance in it, but it didn't really become completely forbidden that if water was to fall in, we would need shishim against the whole 21. No, you don't. Okay, it's enough to have shishim against the one of wine. Okay, that's what we said right now. However, ki ata Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda amar Rabbi Yochanan comes our 4th nichute, as we call them, person who came from Eretz Israel to Babylonia and said, no. What Ravin said, lo shanu ela, when Rabbi Yochanan said that he only meant shenafal kiton shamayim tchila. That's only if first you have water, then you have forbidden wine that fell into the water, 1 to 60. It was nullified in that mixture. Aval lo nafal kiton shamayim tchila, and then the other wine fell in. Okay, the 20 permitted wine. Then Rabbi Yochanan agrees that the water already overpowered the wine, so we don't say, oh, well, now mino fell in, well, it's not batel, and you need water against the whole thing. Aval, Lo nafal shel kiton shamayim tchila, but if it was first wine into wine, like we said before, matzah minim mino v'ne'ol. Okay, these are very important principles in kashrut. Okay, this concept of number one, ro'im et ha'eter ki'ilu eino, right? But comes the second verse of Rabbi Yochanan said matzah minim mino v'ne'ol, meaning the opposite of what Ravin said in the first case, which is if the wine fell into the wine and forbade it, that basically creates a situation where two similar types, right, wine and wine, mixed in. Now, the one of wine forbade the rest of the 20 of permitted wine, and now we have a strong, in other words, ne'or means it woke it up, it strengthened the 20 that were permitted. It now made them all forbidden. And if water falls in after 60, it doesn't have enough to overpower the 21 of forbidden wine now, because all 21 became forbidden. Okay, so he says it would only work if there is a concept where it works, but that's if already the wine was nullified into the water. Then later more wine comes, that doesn't ruin it. We don't look at it as min b'mino. Okay, once the min b'she'eno mino combo happened and it nullified, it's nullified. Okay, and anything that happens after won't mess it up. But if the wine already forbade the other wine, too late. There's nothing we can do about it. That was the fourth statement we saw in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, the first two had to do with each other, right? There were different versions. Is it pouring from a barrel, Rishon Batel, or maybe only pouring from a cod? The second two was this debate about what Rabbi Yochanan said about ro'in et ha'eter ki'ilu eino. Okay, can you ignore the min b'mino part, right? And it doesn't really become forbidden, or can you not say that? However, and this is probably why this sugya is here, because some people say, ika de matnila matnitin. Some people say this last statement of Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda wasn't actually said about Ravin, the same exact words, but they were actually said about our Mishna, and that's probably why they brought this here. Yayin b'yayin b'kol shehu. On the words wine mixed with wine nullifies it, right? Wine mixed with wine makes the whole substance forbidden. Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, on that line, Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo shanu ela shelo nafal sham kiton shamayim. When is min b'mino going to be bad and forbid the whole thing? When there's no other water in there. Okay, when there's nothing that's she'eno mino there, and it's just min b'mino, two of the same type. Aval nafal sham kiton shamayim. But if water were to fall in together with this substance, even after the wine was already mixed with the wine, okay, you're going to notice this sounds exactly like Ravin, okay? We can ignore the 20 of permitted wine that was in there. Even though it became forbidden, it wasn't really forbidden. And so when we say min b'mino b'mashu, we're going to be very strict when it's two of the same type, that's only temporarily until something else doesn't fall into it. But if there was 60 water against the one forbidden of wine, even though there was already min b'mino and the wine mixed with the other wine, it doesn't matter. We view the heter, what was originally permitted, as if it's not there. And the min b'mino, one overpowers the other, and we're good. And then he matches exactly what Ravin said. So either he disagrees with Ravin, if we view his statement was made against Ravin, or if we say his statement was made against the Mishna, on the Mishna, and now we see how this all connects. Because on the Mishna we say min b'mino b'mashu, but not if we have this also water there. Okay? Even if the water came at the end. That's the second way of reading Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. Now the Gemara is just going to say something that's obvious from what we just explained. And what's the difference whether you say his statement was made on the Mishnah or his statement was made on Ravin? There's an obvious difference. The second way we read it, who reads it as if it was said about the Mishnah itself, lo ba'itchila. You don't need the water to fall in there first. Even if the water falls at the end, it still overpowers the wine, the forbidden wine. And if you say he said it against Ravin, right, on Ravin's statement, and he limited Ravin's statement, then you're going to need the water to be there first in order for the min b'she'eno mino to overpower and view the wine as if it's not there. That's only if the wine fell at the end. But if the wine fell before the water, then it's not going to work. Okay, thus ends that section. However, we're not completely ending it, because now we're going to end up with another machloket. Sort of, it's a similar situation to the one Ravin brought. and we're going to see a new opinion about this. Right now we have two opinions. Does the water have to fall first, right? Does the forbidden wine in the water first? That was the second reading of Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda. The first reading of Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda after Ravin came. Or what Ravin said, and the second version of Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, which is that you don't need the water to be there first, even if the water comes at the end. It's fine. Now we're going to have something, a minor difference, and a different shita that we haven't seen yet, which is chizkia. And then we're going to see Rabbi Yochanan, which we're going to see Rabbi Yochanan. We quoted him before, but remember we quoted two versions. Now we're going to see what they say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And that's going to match something we saw before. So if wine that was offered as libation falls into a pit with other wine, and there was ketone of water there. Now here we're going to say it sounds like the water fell at the end, but that's not the case. Okay, Rashi is going to clarify for us that on the top of the next page, that we mean that the water was already there, and the wine was already there, and the water, the yayin nesech, fell in at the end. The very last thing to go in was yayin nesech. Amar Chizkiah, turning now to Amud Bet, higdilo be'isul asur. If the wine comes at the end and basically adds isser to this, right? There was. Let's go to our example: 20 parts wine, permitted; 60 parts water, permitted. Comes one part of yayin nesech, falls into there. Okay, it basically turns all the wine into isser, and you now have 21 wine against 60 of water. That's not going to be nullified. Higdilo beheter mutal. But if you started with wine that was forbidden, mixed in with water, and then you added wine at the end that was permitted, okay, so you had 60 of water against 1 of wine, and then you added 20 more of, against the forbidden wine, and then you added 20 more of the good wine, the kosher wine, well, that's going to add heter, right? It was already mutar because it was already nullified, and then you add, even though there's wine in wine, it doesn't turn to become forbidden in that case. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, okay, that was an opinion we didn't see before, because this is talking about if the wine fell at the end, the permitted wine, it'll be permitted. If the forbidden wine, it'll be forbidden. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, afilu higdilu b'isul mutal. Rabbi Yochanan said even if you add yayin nesech at the end, it's totally fine. Why? That matches what Ravin said about him before, because you have wine and water. The truth is this matches either version, because you have wine and water that were all permitted. Then you added 1 part wine that was forbidden into a combination of water was there already, well, the wine is nullified into the water. Even though there's other wine there, we don't say, oh, min b'mino, it strengthened each other. Okay? Now, Amarle Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zarah. Lema chizkiv Rabbi Yochanan bepluted Rabbi Lezer v'Rabbanan kamifli. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rabbi Zarah, why don't we suggest that the machloket chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan is the same machloket as Rabbi Lezer and the rabbis? Okay, what's that? Ditnan says in the Mishna, Seor shechulim v'shel truma. We're talking about truma and non-truma produce. Okay, we have in this case it's a leavening agent that was chulin and one of truma. Shenaflu l'toch ha'isa, and they fell into a dough. So now you're going to leaven this dough with both a mixture of truma and chulin. The question is, do we call the dough chulin or do we call it truma? And if it's truma, it's going to be forbidden to anyone who's a non-kohen. Lo bazeh kedei l'chametz, v'lo bazeh kedei l'chametz. Neither one is powerful enough. The leavening agent is not strong enough to actually leaven this dough. Okay, the ratio is not enough. Okay, we're going to compare this. The ratio is not enough to forbid the whole thing, like one, right, with there's 60 parts water to 1 part of isser. V'nitztarfu v'chimsu. But together they combined and they leavened it. So the chulin and the truma together, though, was enough to leaven the dough. Rabbi Eliezer Omer acharon aniba. Rabbi Eliezer says, we follow whatever went last. If the makes sense, right? Because if the first one couldn't have leavened it by itself, but the second one caused the leavening to happen in the end, even though it itself couldn't have forbidden it. But since it, in the end, that was the one that was the catalyst to make it leaven, then we follow the last one. Now, who is this similar to? This is like Chizkiah, because what does Chizkiah basically say? If the yayin nesech came at the end, then it's forbidden. If the yayin heter came at the end, it's permitted. It goes by whatever went in last. Whereas the rabbi said, we don't care which one went in last, right? As long as you have 60 water against 1 of wine, right? The Isser wine, it's nullified. So that's going to match what the rabbis say here. Chachamim omrim bein nafal isur b'tchila ubein basof eino asur ad sheyadeh bo kadei lachmitz. It doesn't matter whether the chulin came first or the truma came first. It doesn't really matter, or which came last. It all matters, did it have enough to leaven it on its own? Now, since the truma was not enough to leaven on its own, we're going to permit it. Same thing with our mixture. Since there wasn't enough of Isser to give flavor, because in the end there might have been enough wine to give flavor, but 20 of the wine was not forbidden. Only one was forbidden. It's not enough to give flavor into the 60 of water, therefore it's not forbidden. Okay, it sounds the same, but it's not really, we're going to see, but it's similar. So now, the response of Rabbi Zarah to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Zarah was Rabbi Yirmiyah's main rabbi. Rabbi Zarah responds to Rabbi Yirmiyah and says, "V'tizbra, do you really think so?" V'hamar Abaye, didn't Abaye say, "Lo shanu ela shekadam b'silei k'taisu"? Abaye says that when Rabbi Eliezer permits, Rabbi Eliezer only permits if you took out, in the case where he said achar acharon, and the last one was the leavening agent of the chulin, that's only going to work. It's only going to be permitted if you took out the truma. But if you didn't take out the leavening agent of truma, asul, even Rabbi Eliezer is going to forbid it. Rabbi Eliezer is going to even forbid in that case. So now, Chizkiah Damar command. Chizkiah matches no opinion. Why is that? Because Chizkiah is going to say that if, according to Rabbi Eliezer, she's not going to fit with Rabbi Eliezer, because when does Rabbi Eliezer is going to forbid if you took the truma out, okay? He's going to permit it in that case. But if you leave the truma in, it's going to be forbidden. Now, the Chizkiah says, even if you leave it in, the original, right, the yayin nesech falls in first, and then the heter falls in after. The case where Chizkiah permits, actually we're going to say that when Chizkiah permits, he permits even when you leave the original yayin nesech there. Well, that doesn't match Rabbi Eliezer. And he's also not going to fit like the Chachamim, because the case where Chizkiah forbids doesn't match the rabbis either, because when does Chizkiah forbid? With the yayin nesech wine at the end, even though it doesn't have enough of Isser in there because there's 60 of water against it. And yet, the rabbis are going to say, even right in the end, it's not going to be forbidden unless it's only going to be forbidden when it has kedei lachmitz. And I think, let me just make sure I said this right. And Chizkiah forbids even if it doesn't have enough kedei lesser, right? That's what I said. Even if there isn't 60 against it, if there is 60 against it, it doesn't matter. It's still going to be forbidden if that's the one that went last. So Chizkiah matches nobody's opinion. So you can't say that that's the machloket. The machloket matches up, and Chizkiah matches Rabbi Eliezer, and the rabbis match Rabbi Yochanan, because Chizkiah can't fit with anybody, really, based on Abaye's explanation of Rabbi Eliezer. So Elahacha beroin kamiflage. We're now going to say the machloket between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan all has to do with this case of roin that we talked about before. L'Chizkiah le-roin, le-Rabbi Yochanan eat-le. Chizkiah doesn't say roin etai ter ki'ilu no. He just doesn't think that there's any concept of let's just ignore. Okay? He says if there was wine and water in there, and the wine that was forbidden comes in later, you can't just ignore the mino issue. The wine mixes with the wine and makes it usher. And the Rabbi Yochanan eat-le. Rabbi Yochanan says you can say roin. That's the whole basis of Rabbi Yochanan's opinion that we saw before. But now the Gemara, and therefore the machloket doesn't have to do with this machloket that we said before, of this machloket tanaim with this or of chulin and truma. So now they say, but wait a minute. According to this, Rabbi Yochanan has roin, but mi lecha Rabbi Yochanan roin. How can Rabbi Yochanan say roin? We view that here as if it's not. V'habai mine Rabbi Asi Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Asi asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question, which would match up exactly with roin, and we're going to see that Rabbi Yochanan didn't answer the question. And if roin works, Rabbi Yochanan should have answered roin. It's going to be very easy here to understand. Shnei kosod, echad shel chulin ve'echad shel truma. We have 2 cups of wine. One was chulin, one was truma, of the concentrate of wine. If you remember, they would dilute it. Umizagan, and then you diluted it. V'irvan zebazeh. So you diluted the wine, you added 3 parts water, and then you mixed up the 2 wines. So you add 3 parts water to the chulin, 3 parts water to the truma, and then you mix them together. V'lo pashatle, and he didn't answer the question whether the forbidden substance is permitted. Now, what's the issue? Can we view the wine? Do we look at the 2 wines as, oh, well, the wines combined together and they're forbidden, right? One forbids the other, and then you don't have enough water to overpower it? Or do we not say that? Now, there's a side question here which doesn't really make sense because there isn't shishim of the water. Some people say that in diluting wine, you don't need shishim. It's enough to have 6 times. So you can have 6 times water to 2 parts wine or to 1 part wine. That's the whole question. Do you view it as 2 parts wine or 1 part wine, and that works? Why does 6 parts water overpower wine? Because wine is terrible if you use 6 parts water. Normally they would use 3 parts water. Another possible answer they give, and again, this is just a side point, that maybe there was so much more chulin of wine and then so much more water, and it would be a ratio where you would have 60 times the water to the 1 of wine. That would be another case where you would get to 60. Anyway, that's a side point. The point is, do we view it like this? Velo pashale. And he didn't answer. Now, if you say we view it as if it's not there, then he should have said that. So the Gemara answers, Mikarlo pashale levasof pashale. He didn't know it at the time, but later when he came up with this approach, then he would know the answer. But this happened before. And in fact, to support that, it was said that Amar Rabbi Ami, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the Rabbi Ami passed down to Rabbi Yochanan, but Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, maybe Rabbi Asi said, where Rabbi Yochanan later actually did give that exact halacha here. Shnei koso. Echad shel chulin, echad shel truma, mezagam be'irvan ze bazeh, u'im et ha'eter ki'ilu eino, v'ashar ma'im rabin alavu mivatzalim otos. You had these 2 cups, one of wine, one of chulin, one of truma. You had these 2 cups of wine. We diluted them both with water, and then they got combined with each other. You can view the heter wine as if it's not there, and the water can come and overpower the wine of Isser and cancel it out. Okay, and then that shows Rabbi Yochanan really did hold rowing. Okay, I'm going to review this sugya before we get to the end. The end of the daf is super easy. I know the beginning of the daf was not so easy. So let's review right now until this point, and then we'll move on. So we had this Mishna, which seemed pretty simple. The difference between mino, mino. What happened was Rav Dimi came and complicated the whole thing because he brings this approach of Rabbi Yochanan that basically talks about that this idea of rishon batel. And then we bring different parts of the Mishna, and then we say, well, the Mishna really can be read by Rav Dimi anyway, a little bit differently, and that it's not Isser falling into Heter, but it's Heter falling into Isser, and then what's at the bottom is what determines, right? And then either it goes by rishon batel, or perhaps some of the cases are where the whole thing fell all at once. Then we have the second statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that it wasn't if you pour from a barrel into a pit, but actually only if you pour from a jug into a pit, or we're going to say each drop gets swallowed up. Then we had this statement of Ravin and of Rav Shmuel. Rav Shmuel, we weren't sure if he said on Ravin or he said it on the Mishnah, but then that got us into the whole issue of rowing. Do we have this concept of rowing if you have water and we have mino and mino all together, depending on the order, and we had all different opinions about which order and what was determining. And then we got into Chizkiah, which was this third opinion about it. Do we view this heter as if it's not there? Right? The other wine, does it not really become completely forbidden? And the water could actually overpower the wine or not. That seems to be the basic distinction, although we have some minor distinctions within that. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now we're going to go to the end of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah said, Zaklal, this is the rule. Min b'mino b'mashu, shelo b'mino b'notein tam, right? So we distinguish between 2 of the same type and 2 of different types. Is it mashu, or is it b'notein tam, depending on the situation? Rav Shmuel, now, notice the Mishnah was talking about yayin nesech, and then it said, and this is a general rule. So it doesn't mean it's a general rule. Well, Rav and Shmuel, the Amri Travayu, kol isurin sheb'torah b'minan b'mashu, shelo b'minan b'notein tam. So Rav and Shmuel basically say, we're going to have a machlokah between them, the rabbis in Babylonia, versus Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael. Rav and Shmuel say all forbidden combinations in the Torah, b'minan b'mashu, shelo b'minan b'notein tam. If they're the same, it forbids b'mashu. If it's not the same, b'notein tam. And zaklal, why does it say this is the principle? Because it's exactly that. Latruya, what does it come to include? Latruya kol isurin shebetorah, to say all things in the Torah, this is all true for them. Rabbi Yochanan, Rish Lakish, Amri Travayu, Kol Isurin Shebetorah, Bein B'minan, Bein Shelo B'minan, B'notein Tam, Chutz Mitevel V'Yayin Nesech. But Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish disagree. They say, no. All Isurin in the Torah, this whole thing of Min B'mino, that's a unique chumrah for yayin nesech and tevel. We'll talk about tevel in a minute. And, okay, whether they're minan, whether they're the same, whether they're different, all other Isurin B'notein Tam, they're only forbidden if they give taste. We don't forbid them at, any small amount. So non-kosher meat falls into a non-kosher meat, into a kosher meat stew. It doesn't forbid the whole thing, only if you taste it, if it's enough that fell in that would cause a difference in the taste. Now, we did say, right, there's no such thing. It's not neutralized. But that's Rav and Shmuel's position. Not everybody agrees. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish think, in all other things, it's benotein tam. It's a special chumrah for tevel, which is non-tithe produce, which is forbidden to eat. If it falls into other produce that was permitted because it was already tithed, it forbids everything b'mashu if it's the same type. If it's a different type, it'll be benotein tam. Right? Because tevel and nesech b'minam b'mashu shalom minam benotein tam. V'zeh klal. So why does it say v'zeh klal in our Mishnah? There's a general rule. Latu et tevel. It's just coming to include tevel. Saying this is a general principle that we apply in one other case. Now we're going to have a very simply Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Shmuel, Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Bright to the proofs the first opinion, bright to the proofs the second opinion. Fairly simple. Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Shmuel. Here's the one that proves Rav Shmuel. It says it explicitly. Kol isuin shebetorah b'minam b'mashu shalom b'minam b'notei tam. This is true for all isurim in the Torah. Min b'mino b'mashu shalom b'minam. If it's notei tam, if they're two different types, only if it gives flavor. Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. That's exactly what we said. All other isurim, whether it's the same type, different type of item, right? The same type of food, different type of food, it's going to be forbidden only if it's enough to give flavor, which is usually shishim, 60 times. Chutzmi, right? There is the 60 times against it. Chutzmi tevel v'yayin nesech b'minam b'mashu shalom minam b'notei tam. Other than what we said in our Mishnah is true for yayin nesech and for tevel. Now the Gemara is just going to end with Bishlama Yenesech Mishum Chumra Avodah Zarah. We understand, according to Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, why we'd have a special Chumrah by Yenesech, because it was Avodah Zarah. We're always strict about Avodah Zarah. Ela Tevel, my time. What's the reason for Tevel to be strict? Well, the answer, Ketero Kachisuro. The same way it's permitted, that's the way it's forbidden. If you have a pile of untithed produce and you take 1 grain of wheat out, that actually permits the whole thing. If I take 1 grain out for truma, that means that I've done my truma, because truma by Torah law doesn't have a measurement. The rabbis gave it a measurement. In fact, it was a range: 1 in 40, 1 in 50, 1 in 60. If you're going to be more generous, less generous, at middle. But by Torah law, 1 fixes the whole thing. So they say, based on Shmuel, right? We're going to say the same way 1 permits, 1 forbids the whole thing. You put 1 grain of wheat that wasn't tithed into a pile that was already tithed, it ruins the whole thing. V'tanya namihachi, and there's a braita to support this. B'meh amru tevel oser b'kolshu b'mino shelo b'mino b'notei tam. This is a braita to support Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. That when did they say tevel is oser b'kolshu b'mino? When they say tevel is forbids in any amount, they're talking about b'mino when it's there's 2 of the same kind, like grain into right, wheat into wheat. But shelo b'mino, if it's 2 different types, it's only b'notei tam, only if it gives flavor. Okay, with that we end. So that was just this big machlok at Rav and Shmuel against Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Is the principle in our Mishnah a principle across the board, or is it only a principle for tevel and yayin nesech? And then we just proved how we know why tevel should be any different than anything else. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.